Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share insights and ideas from my guest expert, Jordan Mitchell. Together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we're stronger together. We are one. So let's meet this week's guest. So Jordan is an employee experience and diversity and inclusion manager at Dynamic Signal. Prior to his current role, he's been fighting for equity and equal freedom for years, most recently as the co-founder, board member, and head of the Counter Human Trafficking Program at a nonprofit in the Chicagoland area. Most importantly, however, he is a husband and father to an amazing 8-year-old girl. Welcome, Jordan. Excited to have you.
Very excited to be here.
Well, tell us, how did you arrive at this work on diversity inclusion? What's your backstory? How'd you get involved in this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think anybody who has a cause that they fight for on a regular basis would probably have some form of personal experience that motivates that. You know, I'm no different. So I'm half African American and half Italian, and it is a very interesting personal experience that has led me to always kind of try to understand the society, the social standards, the inclusivity that may or may not exist. I've always wanted to dive deeper into those topics and those things because I was living them every day. You know, what does it mean to be Black, or what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be mixed, or a woman, or an LGBTQ community? Just, I wanted to make sure that I was learning on a regular basis and advocating for what I believe to be is equality and equity for everybody. And so that was something, ever since I was a child, I was a big part of wanting to be a part of what I do. And then I joined the military at 19, and shortly after joining, I saw human trafficking firsthand overseas, and that was something that the inequity that ends up bringing somebody to the point of being trafficked or becoming a trafficker was astounding, and it became a massive pillar in who I wanted to be and who I wanted to fight for moving forward. And so that's what led me to start the nonprofit. That's what has started all of my work in inclusion and diversity and equity. And so I've been doing that for years.
Oh, what a cool story. And it started as a young child and your own diverse dimensions and identities that you had simultaneously, being African American and Italian, you said. So it's interesting. Already off the bat, I have so many questions, but first, a really tactical one on language.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of my friends ask me questions like, okay, so if somebody is half Black and half white, and they don't know, the ethnic origins beyond that, but they know that part, what do you say? Because as a kid that grew up in the 90s, we use the term that you use, mix, but I've also heard a backlash to that term. So what terms do you prefer for having multiple racial identities?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I think this is something that is absolutely appropriate to allow for an individual to answer for themselves. You know, I for myself, I have always grown up, I definitely a kid of the 90s as well. So mix definitely just has always sat with me in my normal vernacular. But I have absolutely been in circumstances where that's been used in a vulgar way. And so I like you got in a weird way, you should kind of know what are the respectful ways to approach it. And so biracial is absolutely a more appropriate term.
Sure.
But if I'm being honest, I would say just we have to start with just not being assumptive, and just in while we should be okay with curiosity and conversation, which I'm a huge advocate for conversation. We should also come in with respect and sensitivity as well.
Yeah. And get to know somebody maybe
Yeah,
before you ask a question
yeah.
like that too.
Yeah, I can't tell me. I definitely look very ambiguous. So
Yeah.
there's a many times in my life where the start of a relationship will, and it's not necessarily a long relationship, but the start of a relationship will begin with, so what are you? You
Not a good way to ask, by
know?
the
Yeah,
way.
yeah. Which I've always been the type to kind of respond with some humor. So
Mhm.
well, last time I checked, I was a human. Like there's, you know, I don't know yet. The scientists have not told me yet. There's different ways, but going back to how we can approach it, to your point, I think building a relationship with somebody is key, and sensitivity and respect is always.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for our listeners, just watch out for making assumptions about someone's racial identity or their ethnic identities. We don't know, right? And
Yeah.
and the problem with that, and white people struggle with this. Like, I was just trying to understand. I was just curious because our brains love categories and we love to categorize people. And when people look at you as a mystery, they want to know, right? I mean, kids want to know, right?
Yep.
Place people. We like to put people in these boxes. And what's really triggering about that is you've probably been asked that a lot over the years. And it's kind of dehumanizing. It kind of takes you out and, yeah, what are you? Where are you from? Like, you can't be from here
Hmm.
is kind of what you're implying with that. So I always say with people, the safe term I like is people of color. If
Hmm.
I don't know someone's racial or ethnic identity, but I can see from the skin color that they're likely don't identify as purely white, like I myself do, I might say person of color or people of color before I get to know the person. And usually I find that not to be offensive. Now, the challenge even with that word is you're assuming as a white person, you don't even have to identify your racial identity. So I try to say I am white in that same vein to honor that we all have different identities and white is not the standard or the default.
Right, and I think it's so important also to be able to identify the glorious and beautiful differences that we all have, and who we are as people. And so, as we look to explore those differences, understand them, identify experiences that are different than our own, so that we can learn from them. We do have to have a very sensitive and respectful approach to that, but it's okay to want to have conversations, to learn from others, and to have those conversations, like you said, around how do we talk about this.
Mhm.
And so it's a great thing that you brought up. I think that's so important.
Well, and people just don't know how to navigate this. And mostly, I mean, white people don't know what to say or do. So they don't say anything. And then you get this like leering weirdness from
Hmm.
them. So it's a barrier, I think, for healthy relationships. And we still live in such a segregated world that I read a statistic recently, 75% of white people live in white communities. So they don't even really know people of color in their communities, right? And they may only interact with a handful at work or in social settings. So it's very problematic when you don't know how to have the language to have a conversation with somebody that has a different racial identity. So thanks for humoring me there, Jordan, and,
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
digging
No,
in.
there was a going into the military. I was in what they call a combat arms position, which means that it's one of those positions that you actually may have to fight at some point, and built on a combat type role. And there's not very many African Americans or Black people that are in those roles. And actually, I was the only Black person on my whole platoon, and that was true for a lot of different parts to my military career. And every time I was a part of a platoon or in a group of military people where I was the one, maybe the only one, maybe one of few, there were white people that said, I have never interacted with a Black person before.
Wow.
And that was always shocking to hear, because I don't know, I am who I am, but I don't remember too many places that I've been where I can't, or didn't want to interact with somebody who was, different in some way, shape, or form. Like I don't know how segregation works.
Right. You're always the only one or one of the only ones.
Yeah, and I just always felt compelled to want to have conversation with others, and so
Yeah.
and learn and have and talk and be united on something and find common ground. And so when somebody says that they've never interacted, by the time they become 20, 22, it's shocking to me,
Yeah.
honestly.
And it's all too often, and that's very common, even for Gen Xers, even for older millennials. Now we're definitely seeing, the dynamics changing, thankfully, with millennials and Gen Zers around diversity and inclusion, increasing ethnic diversity, and it really being a staple in the workplace that they expect diversity and
Hmm.
inclusion, which I think will really drive a lot of really positive change. But for us, old timers, a little bit, which feels weird to even say, it wasn't always the case. I remember several work settings. I was just the only woman, and let
Yeah.
alone there were no people of color. So being the only, tell us about that, Jordan. What is that like for folks that haven't experienced being the only in the room, being the only, like you said, in your military group, being the only, and these hard conversations that we're having nowadays. What does that feel like? Just give us a window into your world.
Yeah, yeah. No, there is a I think there's a universal. I think you said it earlier. We kind of try to categorize often the different people and things that we see in our brains. Like our brains want to categorize people. So when we see something that is not from the normal by which we are surrounding ourselves with, we want to either identify it and as something like, oh no, I want to understand it so I can go away from it, so I can hate it, so I can, can be fear it. There's a, I want to know what it is so that I can put it in a negative category. And then there's the other side, which is I want to identify it and I want to understand it so that I can put it in a positive category. And so when it comes to people, and we're not talking about it's anymore, but people, uh, those realities still exist, and yet then that causes an us versus them mentality. And so when you get into a being the only one type of scenario, you find yourself often going between those two scenarios where somebody starts off the interaction combative or hostile or with hesitation or with walls up, because they're trying to confirm their biases. They're trying to say, like, here's the things I think you are, like, prove that to me. And they go about that in interesting ways. They look for that confrontation so that they can be proven correct. But then there's others who are 100% open, and not assuming, not coming in with preconceived notions of who they think you are based on what somebody said somewhere else. And so you absolutely are confronted with both types of people. And I've had those. I think one of the ones that stands out to me, um, other than the what are you, which is somehow slightly neutral compared to these two experiences that I'm talking about. There are moments in time where I've had somebody confront me, and say, just call me the N-word in their first line of communication.
Wow.
Um, and that is something that is very difficult to overcome, right?
Yeah.
I think we can all understand that if that word is the first word you hear when being talked to,
Ooh.
it starts to navigate the rest of the relationship that may or may not
Yeah.
exist. And that happens far more than I think many understand, in the workplace, outside the workplace. And sometimes it may not necessarily be that word spoken, but it is that same mentality of, well, what can you bring to the table?
Yeah.
Just say, okay, I don't know how to necessarily respond to the emphasis on you, but
Right.
um, you know, but there are moments in time where it's like, well, are you sure that you can do this? I heard recently, and this is not necessarily my experience, but it speaks to an experience similar. where there was a female that was the only female on the team, and you could probably speak to this far more so, but she was confronted initially with the first response saying, "Wow, you actually dress professional."
Oh, yeah. The
Yeah,
word
and
actually is unhelpful for sure.
yeah,
Right? And the
100%.
inflection, right?
Yes, those little microaggressions, the power of language in that
Yeah.
moment is so transparent to somebody and who they are. And then so I've definitely had those, but then I've also had moments in time where someone will literally start by inviting me to eat with them. They'll start by asking if I want to, hang out later, or they're, do I have a family? They want to talk through who am I as a person, and they want to have an interaction with me. And those relationships always start off better.
Yeah.
And I think they come from a place that is more authentic. You're going to get a more authentic version of myself. And some of the best friends I've ever had in the military, which become brothers without a doubt, and I don't use that term lightly, but
Yeah.
um, those moments start off with, I just want to have a relationship with you, and through that relationship I want to understand who we are together,
Yeah.
as friends, as members of society. And so I have definitely had both interactions without a doubt.
Yeah. Well, I love that you underscore that. Yeah, it's not all negative. But the microaggressions that you referenced, they are cumulative. And I think this is what's really hard to understand as an outsider that doesn't experience diversity or microaggressions very often. It's the impact of it happening 20 times in a day
Hmm.
that takes the toll. It's not the one time you got interrupted. It's not the one time people said, yeah, actually, you're pretty articulate. It's when it happens the 20th time, you're like, come on, I have so
Yeah.
much more to bring to the table. And
Yep.
what's so interesting is, as a woman, yeah, I definitely can identify with some of those experiences as well. Obviously, racial dynamics different, but I remember thinking, they have no idea how much more I could be bringing to the table.
Hmm.
They just
Right.
have no clue, right? The bar seems to be incredibly low here. I
Hmm.
don't know why. And so and this is the work you do now, right? Inside
Hmm.
organizations and working with your clients, is all this untapped potential we have from diverse groups of people that are signaled to that somehow they don't belong, right? Somehow that they don't have as much value to bring. And if only, to your second point, what you shared, if only we were more curious, if only
Hmm.
we got to know people as humans more, only we looked at people as, wow, what a different perspective they're going to bring to the table, instead of like, oh, what are they going to bring?
Right, right, right. Yeah, no, losing that assumption is I think is one of the first steps you have to have
Right.
if you're trying to overcome these gaps. The funny, not necessarily funny, but the interesting thing I hear quite often, and when I talk to different people in different organizations and those things, is when we talk about recruiting and sourcing, and one of the things that gets brought up is like, well, I definitely want to bring in talent diversity, but I want to ensure they're qualified. And my
What are you
initial,
implying there?
right, every time my initial reaction is like, why would you assume that they would not come with the qualifications necessary? Like what other situations do we do that in? Are we like, hey, I'd really like to hire this plumber, but I want to make sure he's actually a plumber. I think I think if
As long
we,
as he's a white guy, probably no, nothing question.
well, well, if we look them up, and I'm going to age myself here, but if we're looking in a yellow book, if we're looking in a phone book under plumbers, uh, we assume they're plumbers. It's not like we call them and we're like, are you sure you're a plumber? So we find ourselves doing that with recruiting and sourcing far too often, where we say we want to bring in talent diversity, but then we juxtapose that with saying, but I only want qualified talent. Yeah. At what point in your hiring process did you hire someone who wasn't qualified for that role? And if you did, then we're in a totally different conversation. You just might be a bad recruiter. Because
Right.
you know what I mean? Like I think we have to start removing those qualifiers as a whole when we talk about diversity. It's like,
Yeah.
well, what are you going to bring? Well, what is any of us going to bring? That has nothing to do with a person's gender or race or ethnicity or orientation. that has nothing to do with their qualifications.
Right.
So why do we put them in the same sentence? Why do we talk about them as if they have to somehow be mentioned in the same breath for it to be qualified? Ironically,
Yeah.
and I noticed that happens far too often, and it's something that that I believe that when we have enough of these conversations, like you and I are having today, and that we start to call
Mm-hmm.
these things out, that we can start to remove those pieces of language that still continues to segregate and cause inequality.
Well, and signal to people that this isn't a place for them.
Right.
Because I can only imagine being a person of color or a person that identifies with the candidate. That like, well, why did they just assume that? Do they assume that about me?
Right.
It's just such a stigmatizing feeling, and I think this is the real work in diversity and inclusion is when somebody says something that's problematic. What do I say? And I have to say, this is a real chance to be an ally. But it's uncomfortable and people
Mhm.
don't know, they don't have the language sometimes, they don't have the skills sometimes to navigate that candid conversation. And so what you said I thought was really helpful, Jordan, is you don't have to have some deep philosophical conversation because someone says something like that. Well, you have to make sure they're qualified. All you have to say is like, well, how do you know they're not?
Right.
Right? Or like, what
Right.
makes you think that? And honestly, when I ask a question like that and then I just shut up, I just zip it for 10 seconds and let the person noodle on it and think. This is the beauty of the virtual world too. It's not as uncomfortable looking at somebody they're thinking. Is they'll pause and they'll be like, oh, I guess I didn't know that. Huh. You're right. I'm like, well, I didn't really say anything. I just asked a question. But people
Right.
will almost always come up with their own conclusion about their biased behavior if they're somewhat self-aware, not always. You
Mhm.
might get some defensiveness, but 90% of the time it's going to go positively.
100% agree. I think I believe in people, and the people that I've interacted with throughout my life. There is a deeper desire, especially now, to be an ally, to be collaborative, to be understanding, to provide equity, all of the things that we're all striving to fight for on a regular basis. I do believe that there are a strong majority of people that want those things,
Yeah.
that there is an inherent human quality uh, of community and equality that we all fight for, that we all want to see happen.
Yeah.
And I think that we just oftentimes don't know how to approach it, or
Yeah.
who do we go to learn from, or what is the book that I should read that'll give me all the answers. We look for these easy, like understandable, non-confrontational ways to approach that desire. But I do believe that we all have that desire.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a universal, but when you talk to children at the most simplistic, you've got an 8-year-old, I've got a 6-year-old.
Hmm.
The concept of fairness
Hmm.
is something that really resonates on a human level and with children from a very young age. And for me, that's what really pulls at the heartstrings of the diversity and inclusion conversation. When I hear stories about kids of color or girls sometimes, or people with different ethnic identities, or immigrants or children of immigrants that have really just negative experiences, that someone says something to them or does something to them, or they somehow get a signal that this isn't the place for me at a young age, a very
Hmm.
young age, they hear that. Oh, there's just something visceral about that that seems fundamentally wrong. That is
Yeah.
not okay. It's not okay for anybody, but especially a child, a sweet, innocent child that has all of the potential in the world. But because of the 0.01% difference in their biology, and there's really no difference racially, but just the
Hmm.
melanin in our skin, just
Right.
because of that, we're going to choose to treat this child differently because they weren't born here. We will treat them differently because they're not a boy, they're treated differently. And that,
Hmm.
oh, I mean, I think at the crux of it all, we can all be an ally, just really dialing into our inner child or the children we know in our lives that are different.
Right. It's kind of I often uh, I have conversations with people that I'm close with, and if something is said that is, like something that we should bring it to attention, something that we should call out a little bit, sometimes I will ask them if they will say that to a child.
That's good.
You know, if you're saying like, oh yeah, this person's this or that, would you say that to my 8-year-old daughter? Or if you're someone who is, let's just say that there's somebody out there who's very unsure and still has some prejudices, let's say is racist, would you be racist to a 5-year-old little boy or girl?
Yeah.
Would you go point to them and call them names with zero understanding of what you're talking about? I mean, we've if we don't have have ever had a 4-year-old kid or a 5-year-old kid, many of us have been around them. There's no 4 or 5-year-old that's going to understand what the N word is. No,
Right.
no one's going to know at that age necessarily what hate is or why, but they can definitely feel the pain
Mm.
when you do something in a way that invokes that type of reaction. And so if you're not going to go do that to a kid, or try to and watch them cry and be okay with that, then we're talking about a whole nother level of humanity. We're not, this is no longer about our society, the people that want to make a difference or those who don't agree with us. This is a whole nother level. And honestly, it deserves a different conversation, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good call out to say, and it really stops people in their tracks and helps them think. And that's what is a challenge with unconscious bias and a lot of the bad behavior we're talking about. We go on autopilot a lot more than we want to think we do.
Mm-hmm.
Our brains love categories, our brains love to save the energy for the tough stuff. But differences and recognizing differences and treating people differently based on those differences is just how our brain works. And so
Mm-hmm.
got to slow it down. We got to have interventions and asking people candid questions like that in the moment, right, can really, when framed correctly, and your tone and your body language signal that it's coming from a good place.
Mm-hmm.
And would you talk to a kid like that? Would you say that to my 5-year-old?
Yep.
I think it really helps people open their eyes and be like, oh, I was on autopilot. That was
Yeah.
not okay. I'm not a
Right.
bad person, by the way. I just
Right.
made a mistake, and we're going to have
Yep.
oopsies along the way. I always say with that, my allies talks, and I think this really makes white men feel so much more comfortable. You're going to screw this up.
Yeah.
You will, and it's okay. And
Yeah.
if anyone shames you for that or blames you, they're not really giving you a chance to be an ally. That's not
Right.
fair either. So I think Brene Brown on her podcast recently said shame cannot be used as a social justice vehicle. And I thought
Mm,
that was perfect.
it is.
Shaming shaming somebody's only going to bring up defensiveness. It's only
Mm,
going to get somebody more rooted and firm in that behavior we don't like. And calling somebody in, bringing them into the conversation is much more likely to increase their awareness, help
mm-hmm.
them get onto the path to see things. And once they've seen them, it's really hard to unsee them. With awareness, we know discrimination and negative, unhelpful behaviors go down. So that's such an interesting point, Jordan. I want to shift topics a bit, knowing what you do for a day job.
Mm-hmm.
So, doing diversity and inclusion work in the corporate environment and working with clients on employee engagement and things that touch inclusion, you and I were talking before we got started today. 2020 has been a little bit of a wild year.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
think we always say this, but I think we really understand like this. I can't imagine another year comparing to this one. It's not even over.
Yeah.
Um, what are you seeing right now? And like focus is on D&I. Obviously, we had George Floyd a few months ago, and
Mm-hmm.
that stirred everything back open again. And we're still seeing, a really nice activity of people speaking out and keeping the conversation alive. My fear is that we're going to run out. We're going to stop talking about it, that we're going to run out of energy or momentum. And this is just going to be a one-time thing again that happens. So tell me I'm wrong,
Yeah.
please, or tell me what you're seeing in your own organization and more broadly in workplaces around inclusion right now.
Yeah. Well, you're wrong. Just,
Yes.
just no, I completely have, you know, I have a similar fear, but I also have hope because there are differences to this year that aren't necessarily all like apocalyptic in our in how things have been. And one of those things has been the glaring reality that we can no longer separate the personal from the professional. There is no place in our ability or capacity to be a professional in today's environment without also being who we are as a person. There might be companies out there that still ask for it. You know, when you walk into this door, you are a marketing professional. You are not, you know, Jordan Mitchell. You are in marketing. You only market for us, and I don't want to hear your thoughts. I don't want to hear what's going on at home. Just when you walk in, you're a marketing professional. Those might still exist, and I'm a believer that if you can think it, it's probably true.
Yeah.
So those probably still do exist, but in a way like never before, we are confronted with how much that is damaging. It is impactful. It is destructive, not only to our society, but to those who care most about profits. It is not good for your business either.
Right.
So COVID, when it came through in the beginning of 2020, and all of us had to shift to new ways of working. While there definitely was still frontline essential workers, those heroes that are in hospitals fighting for people's lives, there were a ton of corporate America, a ton of people who could shift to remote. And what happened was, is the employee experience changed. We looked now at the people that were remote, and we saw that their workday included the children that are at home with them, the dogs barking in the background, the garbage trucks going by every day, the laundry going off in the other room. It became that I am doing my professional version of me. If I was segregated those things, if I compartmentalize those things, I now couldn't. I am who I am in my home and being that marketing professional. So there was no ability to say, well, when you walk through this door, no one was walking through doors. It was, you are now in a window to who I am as a person, more now than ever before at a grand scale. And so because COVID brought that to light, what it also did was bring to light the inequities that exist in how it is that we communicate, how it is that we have conversations, how do we support workforces, how do we have an inclusive culture and environment where we can understand the person and the individual and give them power to be their most authentic selves. How do we do that when not everyone's in the same room anymore? How do we do that when, and this is a really interesting, sobering statistic, 80% of our global workforce is frontline essential workers. That means our drivers, our nurses, our police officers, the people that have to be physically present make up 80% of our global workforce, but only 1% of them represent our spend on supporting those employees from a business and institution perspective. So how can we talk about supporting and being inclusive and engaging our workforces if we're not even including them in the conversation? If we are still trying to tell them that they can't be themselves on a Zoom call when my 8-year-old daughter comes over asking me for help on her homework, or my dog barks at that garbage truck. How can you tell me that you support me while also trying to negate who I am as a person? And that, so we've saw that with COVID. And then as that began to transition into the George Floyd conversation, the Breonna Taylor conversation, it became something where our personal lives are no longer just the dog barking or the child. It is now also, I am sitting here as a Black man looking at the news while I work on my computer at home. And as the George Floyd video is being played, my daughter woke up from her room, walked into my office, and saw that video. And at the time, I was not racing to a remote to turn that off. I don't necessarily, and this isn't a parenting moment, but that's like conversation. But at that moment, I do feel it is important that my daughter understand that there are some issues, that there is racism. However, there is hope and that we can be united. So that's a deeper conversation for another thing. But anyway, she came into my office, she looked at the TV, she saw the video, and she said, I still don't understand, Dad. Why would people do something like that to somebody else just because of the color of their skin. And
Yeah.
and that moment was not only just powerful for me as I sat there and was like, correct, I agree, that is difficult. But then she followed it up with saying, if it ever happened to you, Dad, I would be so sad. And that is me as a father, as a man, as a black man that has to be confronted with the conversation with my daughter, who has to witness those evils, to say to somehow now group me in a separate conversation than also being a working professional. And that cannot exist anymore.
No.
And I believe that there are enough people that have been confronted with that reality, whether they are black, brown, female, male, transgender. It doesn't. Every person is feeling that pain and anger and fear to some degree, no matter where they stand, and they are no longer able to divorce who they are as a person with who they are as a professional.
Yeah.
And so the hope that I have, and the reason I believe that 2020 will mark a very important moment in our history, is because of the fact is we are continuously now confronted with that on a regular basis.
Yeah.
We are continuously having to explore these conversations and these discussions in a way that allow us to come together and find the solutions that is for everybody, that is with everybody, united through collaboration, conversation. How do I engage with the truck drivers? How do I communicate with the nurses?
Yeah.
How do I support them? How do I have those conversations and ensure that we are doing what's best for everybody? And I listened to at this point it was been years, but it stuck with me. I listened to a TED Talks a long time ago, which brought up the conversation that said, talking about, and I'm going to paraphrase, but talking about what's best for everybody without asking everybody is like asking what's best for the turkey before you shoot them and eat them in Thanksgiving.
Good
And
analogy.
and it's such an interesting, it was an analogy that really stuck with me, which was like, how do we know what's best for our Black communities? How do we know what's best for our Hispanic communities, or for the gay and lesbian and transgender communities? How do we know what's best if we're not actually having conversation? And I believe, like, for one of the first most widespread times that I can remember, or that I've read about, we are having those conversations.
Yeah. It's so true. Oh, that story with your daughter, I know, will stick with me. And not at all the same that you shared, but I had a conversation with my daughter after the passing of George Floyd. And when she said, it really hit me like a ton of bricks. She said, Mama, I don't understand why they have to die. And it just was so hard. I mean, just thinking about it now, I can only imagine how you felt.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I've learned, and when I talked with African American men, or men of color in general, have told me, you don't understand because you're white. And so and I'm a woman, right? So when I watch the police video, or I watch police or sense police when I'm driving or walking,
Mm-hmm.
I feel safer. Obviously, if I watch something that horrific, like what we all had to watch, it's very hard, but I don't see myself in that position. I don't see that happening to me, or that could happen to me. It's very, very different as a man of color, especially a Black man, to see that and know that could potentially happen to you, because it happens a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And that really struck me as empathy, right? Just like your turkey analogy. Like we can't know what it's like to be somebody else. I can't change my skin color. I
Mm-hmm.
can't change the skin colors of my family or my closest friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of fixed. And so we have to get a growth mindset around this and be curious and be empathetic and take on these behaviors that I think sometimes is hard as an
Yeah.
ally, to go out of your comfort zone and do some of these things. But I always say with people on the other side of it, I just truly believe you become a better human. You become better as a parent, much like the conversation you're having with your daughter. I don't remember having any conversation about race. It was all negative if I did as a child. And we're talking very actively about what racism is and why these things happen. And I usually don't have great answers, but we just navigate it together. So I'm hopeful for the future, because you're right. We're having some pretty bold conversations and continued conversations today.
Yeah, and there was a conversation I had actually earlier today, which starts to translate, how do we turn conversation into action, especially when it comes to
Yeah.
our workplaces. And that conversation led to, great, we've had conversation, let's continue those conversations, but what is the system within our institution, and what are the gaps within that system by which we need to identify and fill through systematic approach?
Yeah, that's
Because
good.
conversation is absolutely key, and conversation and collaboration are something I definitely try to hit home all the time, with being incredibly important as it promotes empathy, understanding. However, if we're not also identifying gaps within our systems, if we're not actually approaching policies and procedures and looking at the institutions that operate within those systems and finding gaps there, then what we end up doing is just having conversation, and then it does fall away. And to the fear that you and I talked about, like making sure that this isn't just a conversation that goes away over time. We have to, in this moment, use the momentum to also then be able to find alignment at the top of those institutions, finding the executives, the leaders, those with the most institutional power,
Yeah.
and show them the gaps that are in the system, show them the policies that could be better and the procedures that we could do that would promote equity and equality, and then make those changes now. And as we begin to do that, we begin to change our systems. It is a revolutionary type of approach only when we think of it as revolutionary.
Yep.
If we just started doing it, it would become something that is normal, that we would be constantly looking to improve. And I believe that there are a lot of workplaces, there are a lot of organizations that are doing that now in a way that says, I want to make a difference. I want to be the institution that helps to identify the gaps in our system and making changes that fill those gaps. And that's, once again, another reason why I believe that we are heading towards a better future.
Yeah. Oh, I love that hopeful optimism. I remain cautiously optimistic as well. And I agree. We have to have conversations start. We got to keep the conversation going. So that recommendation one, keep the conversation alive. And then two, leverage it to really find those barriers and systemic issues that are preventing positive change. We
Mm,
know that there are things buried in corporate America, hiring processes, recruiting processes, performance management, you name it,
mhm.
across that employee experience, really digging into that and thinking, what systemic changes do we need to make? And then, of course, with racism as a whole, so many systemic changes with voting rights, redlining, housing, education. I mean, gosh,
Yeah.
it's pretty much every fragment of society, right? But what
Mhm.
can you do from where you're at? Get informed, participate, especially locally. You can make much more of an impact. I know we get frustrated nationally, but locally in your community, driving these conversations and positive change through how you vote does make a big difference.
Definitely.
So awesome, Jordan. Well, tell our listeners, how do they get in touch with you? How do they follow you?
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn, just Jordan Mitchell. And there's a lot of Jordan Mitchells on LinkedIn. Um, but I work for Dynamic Signal. So if you just type that in, you will see my smiling face. Um, and then also, I am on Twitter on @JamDiversity. Those are the two spots.
Awesome. Awesome. We'll be sure to link to those in the show notes, listeners. And Jordan, thanks so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed hearing your personal stories, your candor, your really spot on recommendations. So I appreciate you doing this work and sharing your voice.
Thank you so much, Julie, for having me. It's been an incredible time, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button and connect with Jordan and I on LinkedIn. You can simply search our names, just like Jordan said, and you can find me, Julie Kratz, Kratz. You can also share this episode anywhere you get podcasts. Every review helps others, allies, find us. Host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.